Welcome back. This is Darren for 1 Plus Armor, and you're watching episode 2 of the How to Play 40K series. This episode will very quickly go over the basic structure of a game in terms of game turns and player turns, and what each phase of the turn is. And then we'll quickly move on to the meat of the rules now, starting with the movement phase. So basically a game of 40k usually lasts for 5 turns or more. Later on in the series we're going to actually go over how to actually start a game and the preparations you have to make, but generally a game will last about 5 turns. Usually there's an option to go on to 6 or 7 turns based on the roll of a dice. But different types of games will have different game lengths, but the standard game is usually 5 to 7 turns. Each turn or game turn consists of 2 player turns, so each player gets a turn within a game turn. Okay, so turn 1 will have player turn 1, and then the other player's turn 1, and then it goes to turn 2. Okay, I think that's fairly easy to figure out. Okay, the structure of each turn is fairly straightforward. You have things that happen at the quote-unquote beginning of the turn. This includes certain actions or army special abilities, and also includes rolling for whether or not your reserves come in. Then this is followed by the movement phase. This is where you move all your models. Then it's followed by the psychic phase. This is where your army gets its opportunity to use psychic powers. Then there's the shooting phase, where your army can use ranged weaponry. Then there's the assault phase, where your armies can charge together and get into close combat. And then there's end of turn phase, where you add up scoring from objectives and do other sort of cleanup type actions at the end of your turn. And then this repeats for every player turn. Terminology wise, you may hear some people refer to the top of the turn and the bottom of the turn. This is kind of like baseball, where whichever team goes first takes the top of the turn, and then the other team takes the bottom of the turn. So that's all that refers to. The movement phase is arguably the most important phase of the turn. The other phases all involve rolling dice of some sort and some degree of randomness, but movement is really where you're almost always guaranteed a certain amount of action, and what you do and how you move and how you face your models and how you move them in and out of cover can really set you up for the other phases. So movement phase is very important. However, movement phase is quite simple. You just have to move your models. So we're going to go over a few movement types. So I'm not going to cover all the different types of models and their movement type, but just go over a few simple movement types and how you do the measurements. We did cover some of the measurements in turn 1, so hopefully this will be a good refresher. So I have my squad of Grey Knights here. They need to move. The usual movement speed for non-vehicle infantry is 6 inches. Okay, so that's fairly standard. So if we have a foot slogging infantry model, usually it will move 6 inches. Okay, so what you do is, these guys are a unit, so they don't all have to move 6 inches. Some of them can move 6 inches, some of them can move 4, some of them don't have to move at all. However, the overriding rule is that you must maintain unit coherency, and if you can't remember what that means, we do cover that in detail in episode 1. So let's say I want to move this guy here 6 inches. So how do you do that? Okay, so I've got my tape measure here, and remember, you measure from the front of the base, and the front of the base needs to move 6 inches. Okay, so he can go up to here. Okay, so remember, as I said last time, you don't move from here and then measure the back of the base, okay? Because then you would have gained an extra inch, okay? You move front of the base to front of the base, or back of the base to back of the base, okay? So front of the base, 6 inches, okay? So now this guy can move. So he can move 6 inches, or he can move 4, or any amount less as long as he stays within his 2 inches of unit coherency, okay? And then you can move your squad. And that's it. That's movement in a nutshell, okay? Now, we're going to talk about other forms of movement. So let's get rid of my infantry here. So let's bring in my Thunderwolves. So these guys are cavalry. You see, these guys are mounted on wolves, so they can move 12, okay? So it's the same principle though. Okay, so this guy's moving 12, moving 12, okay? But it's the same principle of measurement, and these guys also must maintain 2 inches of coherency, okay? And let's do one final example. I got my bikes. Okay, so these guys are Marines mounted on bikes, and they again move 12. So it's the same thing as the cavalry, and they also have to maintain 2 units of coherency, okay? Okay, any good board of to play Warhammer 40k on has good amounts of terrain, and terrain is it's scenic and also provides a lot of function in terms of cover for your armies. But you have to move through it. So the game will allow you to move vertically in terrain as long as you remain, as we said last time, 6 inches of unit coherency vertically. But you have to have enough movement to actually move vertically, unless beforehand you've agreed with your opponents another system of which you can move up and down. So if my guys here want to move up onto this step, they have a movement of 6, so they really can only go up to here in one movement phase, okay? So that's how that works. If you have a shorter vertical distance, you can of course move multiple levels, or you can move up and down, okay? That's verticality, and they want to move from the ruin to the other side of the ruin. So they want to go through this window here. Okay, so this is what they would call difficult terrain. Okay, and to move through difficult terrain to represent how difficult it is to climb around the rocks and the debris and to move through the window in your power armor. Now, to move through difficult terrain, you roll a 1d6. And then you get to move that amount, okay? So you could end up moving 6 again, but you may end up just moving 1. So we rolled 1, so they could only move 1 inch and they'd still be in the ruins, okay? Now keep in mind, if they started outside the ruins here, they wouldn't have to roll to get into the ruins, okay? But when they're in the terrain, to move through the terrain or to move out of the terrain, they would need to roll their 1d6, okay? And if any one model is still in the terrain, the whole unit counts as moving through the terrain and difficult terrain, okay? Now there are types of terrain called dangerous terrain, so you may determine that certain terrain on your board counts as dangerous terrain, or if you have certain model types, such as bikes, okay? So bikes have a special rule. Bikes are allowed to move through terrain without any penalty, okay? So they can just drive right through the window, no problem. However, they treat difficult terrain as dangerous terrain, okay? And dangerous terrain doesn't slow them down, but you have to roll a d6. If you roll a 1, you can take a wound, okay? And the wound you can save with your armor, but if you roll a 1 on dangerous terrain check, you will take damage, okay? And you have to do that for every model that moves through the dangerous terrain, okay? But otherwise, bikes and other unit types that have special rules allow them to move through the terrain without having to roll the d6, okay? So one thing you cannot do when you move is you cannot end up on top of another model, okay? So physically, you know, your bike can't end up on top of another bike. So that's just a rule that applies throughout the game. You cannot have one model on top of another model. Even if you have a flyer, which is in the air, it still has a base, and you cannot put the flyer or any other model overlapping another model, okay? So that's one rule. The other rule is that you cannot be within closer than 1 inch to an enemy model, okay, in your movement phase. So let's say my Thunderwolves here, okay, they're fighting my Grey Knight guys, okay, and they want to move 6 and maybe they want to charge in. So in their movement phase, they cannot end up closer than 1 inch to any enemy model, okay? That's just not allowed. The only time you're allowed to be within 1 inch of an enemy model is in the assault phase when you're assaulting, okay? So in movement phase, you must stay 1 inch. So let's say these two models are like this, okay? And they're from 2 different units. So these guys, if they wanted to move between them, they could only do that if there was enough gap for them to fit through here without at any time being less than 1 inch from an enemy model. Okay, so it even counts as you move. So if this gap is too small, these guys would not be able to move through the gap. They would have to move around the gap. Okay? And there's some circumstances where that comes into play. If these guys are forced to retreat and they have to go that way and they can't move that way, then they end up dying. Okay, so that's one example of how that works. The final thing to talk about movement is wobbly model. So we got a runes here. It's a fairly small runes, but it has space on the top for you to stand. My Dread Knight wants to stand at the top, but look, the base is so big, it doesn't really balance up here. And it's not safe, and nobody wants their models to be damaged, but everybody agrees that the Dread Knight could stand up here. So what you have to agree then, that there's a wobbly model situation, and the Dread Knight can be put as close as possible to that position where it's safe, and everyone agrees that it's just up there, okay? And that's called the wobbly model. So some unit types can move over infantry that others can't, and it can stop in those places, just flyers and skimmers. But if they can't physically sit there, then wobbly model's in effect, and they can go in the next safest area, okay? One final thing to say is if you and your opponent decide something is called impassable terrain, then you cannot move through that terrain. You have to go around it. Or if you're a flyer, you can fly over it. Or if you're a jump, you can jump over it. But impassable terrain, you have to go around. You can't move through. Whereas terrain that has windows and things, generally you're allowed to just go through the window. Okay? All right, so that's basically movement in a nutshell. I hope that was pretty clear. Movement's pretty straightforward, but as I said, very strategically important. Do come back for episode 3, where we'll be covering the psychic phase.